Afternoon and good morning, everyone. And thank you for joining us from all around the world. Tonight's event is sponsored by the Purdue Global University Public Safety Department and is presented by Alpha Phi Sigma Criminal Justice Honor Society. My name is James Ebert, and I'm a professor at Purdue Global University. And I would like to personally welcome you for joining us for what promises to be a powerful, thought provoking conversation. Tonight's event centered around the book Death Row: The Final Minutes, which is a deeply compelling and emotionally charged book written by our guest tonight, Michelle Lyons. Michelle has spent over a decade witnessing over 270 executions in the Texas prison system. Her firsthand perspective sheds light on one of the most complex, controversial aspects of the American criminal justice system, the death penalty. We are honored to have Michelle Lyons with us this evening to share her insights, experiences, and reflections on the human stories behind the headlines. Guiding our conversation tonight is Professor Maryanne Drenner, a nationally respected authority on prison and street gangs, and also a faculty member here at Purdue Global University. Professor Drenner brings decades of criminal justice experience as well as an informed perspective to tonight's dialogue. Attendees, feel free to place questions in the chat box, and we will attempt to address as many of those questions throughout tonight's event. Now, please join me in welcoming the author Michelle Lyons and our moderator, Professor Maryanne Drenner.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Hi, everybody. And I know I have some students out there. I recognize some of the names. So hello to some of my former students. Um, to get started, Michelle is a really good friend of mine, and I'm really honored that she's here. She's a fellow foodie class. You all have heard me talk about my food experiences. Well, she's a fellow foodie, and we do get together and go to some really good restaurants and have great conversation. But I'm really happy that she's joined us tonight. I know if you've been in my classes before, you've seen the PowerPoint and you visited the Death Row website. So, and there's been a lot of questions that I couldn't answer. So if you were in my classes, please put them out there so we can see them. But to get started, Michelle, I guess just give us a brief summary, maybe just to brief the Reader's Digest version of how you actually got into doing becoming, a PIO for the prison system.
Sure. So, I was a journalism major in college and became a newspaper journalist when I graduated. Now, I started with, I'm sorry, my first assignment was covering the education system. So, the complete opposite of prisons. I'm dealing with children and science fairs and things like that. And then I took a job in Huntsville, Texas. And I think, as most people probably know, that is where the execution chamber is located. It's where the prison system is headquartered. And so when I went to Huntsville, I was not still really giving a lot of thought to the death penalty or the prison system because I went to cover the city of Huntsville. I'm writing stories about city budgets, those kinds of things. In 2000, there was a job opening at our paper for the prison beat. And I thought, the prison system to me is just so fascinating. It's huge. And there's so many aspects of it that I didn't think the public knew about. So I thought I'd love this beat. Um, I knew that when I took that job that a part of it would be witnessing executions because the prison reporter at the Huntsville newspaper, since the execution chamber is located there, had a seat to attend every execution. There are 5 media witness spots, and so the Huntsville item was always one. So I knew that I would have to witness a few, but in previous years, there hadn't been that many. So I took it thinking I might have to witness 12 executions, maybe if it's one a month. I completely miscalculated that. And that year in 2000 is when our then governor Bush was running for president. And when that happened, there was a national spotlight that was turned on Texas. And I think as a result of that, the executions completely skyrocketed. And that year, there was a record breaking 40 executions. And so this first year where I'm thinking I might have to witness maybe a dozen executions, there were 40. And it didn't really slow down. So I stayed in that role. until 2001. And the prison system actually asked me to leave my job as a reporter and come on to be their spokesperson. They had never had a female before, and they wanted someone who could speak Spanish. And so I went to work for the prison system, knowing that in that role, I would still have to witness the executions.
So maybe tell us, Michelle, your first one. Do you remember, and I've read your book. In fact, I have bought your book for people, given it as a gift, and I get great reviews about it, just fantastic reviews about it. And I'm always proud to say she's my friend.
Thank you. Thank you.
But what is your first one the one you really remember? I mean, actually, let me just say, do you remember your first one? Is it like you can remember every aspect of it, or what stood out, and was it what you expected?
I remember most aspects of it. It was in 1998, actually. So I had been at the paper. I was not the prison reporter, but the prison reporter had some conflict where they couldn't attend. And so she asked if I could step in. So I thought at most I will ever witness one execution, and it will be this one that I'm going to in 1998. I remember the case was out of San Antonio, and the crime was that he had beat two elderly men to death with a hammer. All of those things I remember. I do not remember his name. I remember he was Hispanic, and again, it was out of San Antonio. Before I went, the prison reporter prepped me pretty well for what to expect. And everything was exactly as she said. One thing about Texas and the execution process is that it is very regimented. There's not a ton of deviation in the order in which things occur and such. And so when I went, everything was as she said. When I got back to the newspaper to write my story, what I think I was most struck by was just how clinical it was. The first one that I attended, there wasn't a lot of emotion being displayed. Now, later on, when I started really witnessing a lot, I started seeing those deviations and seeing a lot of emotion, whether it was from the victim's family or the inmate's family. That one didn't really have any. It was a very clinical procedure. And so when I got back to write my story, I was a little bit, I think, unsettled by the fact that, I had just witnessed this person effectively die in front of me, and that it wasn't, churning around in, I guess, in my mind, and I really, I think, told myself, but that's normal because I'm a reporter. I'm supposed to be unbiased. I'm not supposed to be emotionally involved in the stories. I'm supposed to keep down the line. And so with that first one, I was able to very easily compartmentalize it.
Wow. So it kind of has become like the first one you realize this is something I'm going to have to do, and you probably put that into your head, that, okay, I'm going to have to see this again. And at what point in this did you finally go, wow? Or was there one that really just jumped out that you went, I'm witnessing all these? Was it like number 100, number 150?
Yeah.
At what point did you finally go, wait a minute?
I started, it really started, I think, when I started working for the prison system in 2001. And I think it was because, when I was a reporter, I would go to death row and I would interview the inmate and might interview them one time. Maybe on rare occasions, I would interview them twice. And then I would see them at the execution. So I didn't really have a ton of interactions with them. When I worked for the prison system, I became responsible for setting up that media day every Wednesday where the reporters would come and they would interview the inmates. So now I'm seeing these same inmates week after week after week, and I'm getting to know them because there'd be time in between where, the reporters are setting up as a TV crew. So they're getting their camera and their mic, all of that stuff ready. And I'm chatting with the inmate. So that started to get a little bit more difficult because, as a human, you start empathizing with the fact that this person, you realize they've done something, you realize they're under a death sentence, you realize that there's a reason they're under the death sentence. But as a human who has had multiple interactions with someone, it just takes on a different look. So the first execution I had a really difficult time with was that of a man named Napoleon Beasley. It was because he was the first inmate that I had really gotten to know well, because he did so many interviews. And he did so many interviews because he was 17 at the time that he committed his crime. Right after his execution, the Supreme Court ruled he had to be at least 18 in order to actually be eligible for the death penalty. So he was probably the last 17-year-old that was executed. And to be clear, he was not 17 at the time of the execution, but he had been 17 at the time of the crime. And so dealing with him, we were roughly the same age. And I think what struck me is that it was the first time that I thought, this is someone on the outside I would have been friends with. This is somebody that, in talking to him, he never denied he committed the crime. He was very forthright about it. He was very apologetic for it. And, I thought, I think this person probably could be redeemed. With that came a lot of feelings of guilt, because here I'm thinking, gosh, I don't want to see this execution. I really hope this execution doesn't go forward. And yet, there's an entire family, a victim's family over here that very much hope it does. And so I felt a lot of guilt for feeling that way. So that's probably the first time that I really had an internal struggle with one of the executions.
I remember that whole thing, because it went back and forth for a while. He killed the father of a judge, was it? I think so.
Yes, the federal judge. Yes.
He
Yeah.
killed the father. Michelle, we have a classmate of yours on here. I was just reading the chat. She says, Anastasia Rubio says, hi, Michelle. I graduated high school with you in Galveston.
Ah, hello.
Yes. Small world.
Hi. Yes. Yeah, for sure.
I have another question. I'm gonna hit up on some questions before I come back with more talk for you. Maisha's asking, were you with the same execution team the whole time you worked there?
No. And that was kind of complicated. And that's, in the end, why I think I witnessed so many executions compared to other people. That I know of, there's one person who's witnessed far more executions, and that's a reporter from the Associated Press named Mike Grochik, because he started witnessing all of the lethal injections in Texas in 1982 when they first began. So he has seen virtually all of them. I mean, there's little pockets where he was not there for a reason or something, but for the most part, he has seen them all, and that's well over 500. But they would change out, and I would stay the same. The warden would change. The members of the tie-down team. So those are the 5 people who are responsible for escorting the inmate into the execution chamber and then putting the restraints on them so that they're affixed to the execution gurney. They would change. The director who would oversee it would change, but I stayed the same.
Oh, and I have, here's one question too. Approximately how many female, Kirsten's asking this, approximately how many female executions did you attend? And if you did they differ from that of the men? I guess how they reacted.
I did. So I witnessed 2 female executions. Not the first woman. She was right before. It was Carla Faye Tucker. Mm-hmm. And that was before I had come to the newspaper. But I witnessed the execution of a woman named Betty Lou Beats. She was in the media portrayed as basically a Black Widow of sorts, because she killed multiple husbands and received the death penalty for it. And then I also witnessed the execution of Frances Newton, who was there for killing her husband and young children. So the main difference to me, especially with the first one, was just, which I know sounds silly, but as a journalist at the time, you're trained to notice everything. She was so tiny. I was used to seeing these men on the gurney, and she was this very, very petite woman. So it was just her size immediately struck me. In both cases, the women never requested a last meal, which the men usually did. Women did not request a last meal, and neither one of them said a word, which also was a little bit unusual. For the most part, all of the men had some sort of a last statement, or they said something when they were on the gurney, and neither woman said a word. So that's probably the main difference. They went in there stoically, and they went out very quietly.
That's interesting. That's a very
Yeah.
interesting point, that the females would go in and just like accept it. I've accepted this. I'm not,
Yeah.
I have nothing else to say.
Mm-mm.
Nope.
Yeah, did not say a word.
And didn't even request a final meal. That's interesting.
No.
And that's I'm trying to read some of the questions real quick. Just trying to go over them. Make sure I don't miss anybody, because I want to get as many. Amanda's asking, getting to know these people and thinking it could have been someone you would have been friends with, going back to Napoleon Beasley. In the real world, do you think it makes you trust people less now?
1000%. I would say that is, and it's hard. Is it a negative? Is it a positive? My child would say it's a negative, that I'm this way because I am hyper protective. I have one child, and that is my world, and I am constantly preaching about personal safety and being aware of your surroundings and things like that, because one thing about this job is you're seeing the worst of people, and what people do to one another. Some of the crimes, the one that first had struck me was, I always had this fear of coming home and someone being in my closet, someone hiding in my closet. Because, back then I lived in a tiny apartment and would come home sometimes late at night after reporting, and just that was a fear. And of course, people would say, oh, but that never happens. That doesn't happen. One of the first executions I witnessed, that is exactly the scenario that had occurred.
Wow.
It was an inmate. He and his girlfriend had gotten into a fight, and somewhere rationally to him, he went to a random apartment and broke in and hid in this woman's closet. When she came in, he ended up, I think he assaulted her and killed her, but he ended up killing her. And I thought, see, this is what I'm talking about. So it definitely makes me, I think, more wary of people.
Well, it does. And I tell people that too, working in a prison, being in a prison, I don't like my back to the wall. I like to, I like my back to the wall so I can see what's happening. I like to know where the exits are.
Exactly.
I do the same thing. What if somebody was in my home?
Yes.
Um,
Or gosh, when I go to an event where, like a concert, if I go to a sporting event, I sit there and think things like, statistically, someone here is, has to be a serious. I have all kinds of strange thoughts like that.
I do too. I'll do too.
I don't think you can help it.
Well, after what we've worked with in a prison, you can't help. You can't, because we've seen the worst of the worst.
Yeah.
Some are on death row and some aren't on death row.
Yeah.
And that's scary. Olivia asks a question. She says, how would you compare executions in media to those in real life? What's fact and what's fiction? She said, she just finished watching Oz. And maybe Michelle here, because when I've used your slide presentation in class, it walks you through, what goes on in a day of an offender that's going to be executed, right? Of course. And my classes are often shocked because that's not what they've seen, on TV or whatever. So it's like, oh, I said, yes, it's like, how many of you had to put a pet down? It's the same process of how you put your beloved pet that's 14, 15 years old. It's the same process. So maybe walk them through, like, maybe what the process is.
Yes. So on the day of the execution, the inmate is allowed to have 4 hours of visits with their family or friends. So every inmate has a visitation list with 10 people on it, and they can have people from that list for 4 hours, which is incredibly unusual because normally their visits are limited to an hour or two, depending on custody levels and when it is and all of that good stuff. So once that visit is concluded, they're then transported, because death row is not at the same unit where the executions occur. It's at a unit that's about 45 miles east of that unit. So they are taken and put in a van and they are transported to Huntsville for the actual execution. When they arrive, that's when I would go and see them. Me and the warden and the chaplain who would be working the execution would go into the holding cell area that was adjacent to the execution chamber and would visit with them. I didn't usually say very much because my job really was to be there to see what their demeanor was, because I would get asked that a lot by the reporters. Did you go see him? How was he? That sort of thing. So when I would talk, I would really only talk about, well, these are the reporters that'll be here. If you decide you don't want to give a last statement out loud, you can write something. We had some inmates that chose to do that, and I would go and get the statement from them and type it up and give that to the media that was there. And then they would spend the afternoon with the chaplain, and that was the only time that they were allowed to make phone calls, because death row inmates do not, or did not back then at least, have phone privileges. So they would spend that afternoon usually on the phone the entire time, talking to people, loved ones and such, and saying goodbye. They would get their last meal between 4 and 5 p.m. And then in Texas, executions can begin anytime after 6 p.m. So if they don't have any appeals pending in any of the courts, then we would get a call from the Attorney General's office and the governor's office saying the execution can proceed. That is one area where it's always different in real life versus the movies. In real life, once that call comes that says you can proceed, nothing is going to stop that execution. The person is taken into the actual execution chamber, and they are affixed to the gurney. An IV team comes in and establishes the IV lines, and then the witnesses are brought in. And I think, in movies, sometimes there's this dramatic moment where you'll have someone on a gurney and then a red phone rings and stop the execution. That will not happen. The funny thing is there is a phone, and I swear in my memory, I think it might have actually even been red, but it never will ring to say stop the execution once that person is on the gurney. They only do it when no appeals are left. There's nothing that's potentially going to stop it. The execution proceeds once the inmate has had the opportunity to make a last statement. And after that statement is concluded, the warden will give a signal and the IV team will start pushing the drugs. That is another thing that I've seen in movies and shows. I've seen where they'll have like a machine that will automatically push the drugs from this little machine. And that's not what happens. 2 times I witnessed from the IV room so that I could truly watch the process from start to finish. And there are members of this team that manually push those drugs. There's a tray, it has the syringes on it. One person has that, the other person takes the syringes and manually was pushing the drugs into the IV line. So there's no disputing on who's actually administering it, or is it done by machine? It's done by hand by a specific person. Once all of that has been completed, a doctor comes in, pronounces the inmate deceased, and then the witnesses come out of the room. So I would say those 2 things, though, the machine versus real people and that phone that'll stop an execution, are probably the 2 things that I see that are most inaccurate when I watch it on TV.
I had a question up here and I want to go back because it's a good one. Let me find it. Where is it? I had a good question. Now I lost it. Like, stop writing so I can find it. Stop writing. Yeah. Okay, here's one. This isn't it, but do many of them end up talking about God, forgiveness, eternity, once, etc., once they've accepted that their execution is going to happen? This is from Dennis Hughes.
Most of them will speak with the chaplain during the afternoon. I can think of maybe only one time where the chaplain told me my presence, like he's made it clear on death row, he did not want this and my presence is going to irritate him. They had to be there anyway, but they didn't try and push it and talk to him or minister to him or anything like that. Somebody either wants that or doesn't. In the chamber itself, that's one of the places where I quickly realized there were the real deviations in how the inmate would speak from the gurney. There definitely were inmates who would pray or would make reference to the fact that they think they're going to a better place, or they would ask for forgiveness sometimes from the victim's family. Sometimes they asked for forgiveness from their own family. The point usually was, I'm sorry I put you through this. I'm sorry you have to be here, that sort of thing. So there certainly was a theme of forgiveness. And then I saw a couple, and really it was limited to a very small number, where the inmate was really angry and said some pretty horrible things in the execution chamber. There was one, it was an odd night. It was a night that we had 2 executions, and having what we basically would be a double execution is very rare. It happens because the execution dates are set by district court judges from all over the state, and Texas is massive. And so you might have a judge, let's say in Dallas, who sets a date for Thursday, and way over here in the Panhandle, another judge sets it, and it happens to be for Thursday. And the way that the prison system handled it was, this death warrant came in first. This will be the first execution. This one came in second. This will be the second execution. And that night of the double, the man who was executed first had a really nasty last statement. He told the victim's family that he hoped that they would die on their way home after witnessing. But then right after that, the second execution, the man was so incredibly remorseful for what he had done, was crying and begging the victims to forgive him. And so it was, especially, I think, seeing it in that, in such a quick span, it really highlighted just the differences of, how these 2 individuals went out.
So one from one extreme who was hateful, angry, I hope you all die on the wreck on your way home, to someone
so
who I'm
sorry.
really sorry for what I
Yeah.
did. And
Yeah.
you know, I please my forgiveness. How
Yeah.
are the families, like when you're there? I remember, I think you told me, Michelle, too, one time we had a conversation, and you said you preferred going in with the victim's family.
I did. I preferred, honestly, to go in with the victim's family, because especially as time went on, and it was especially after I became a mom, I had a really hard time witnessing on the inmate side, because the difference really was that, okay, you're on the victim side, and they were separated by a wall. Both are looking into the chamber. The victims would stand basically at the inmate's head, so that if he looked to the side, they were right there. And then if he looked towards his feet, the room next to it was where his own witnesses were. On the victim side, you have a family that has suffered a horrible loss, but usually it's been at least some years ago. And so while there was emotion on that side, it was usually pretty tempered. On the inmate side, however, you had family members and oftentimes mothers who were watching their child die in front of them. And after I became a mom, I really had a difficult time with that, because, it's easy. Everybody always empathizes, of course, with the victims and the victim's family, but they didn't ask for this. But when you think about it, neither did this family. This mother did not ask for to be in this position, for a choice that their child made. And you would see really sometimes extreme emotions and sobbing and wailing. And I mean, how could you not when you're watching your child die? And I started having a harder and harder time with that. So I tried as much as I could to stay on the victim side.
Makes sense. It makes sense. I have a question here too. This is an interesting question from Mariah Arnold. She says, you discussed the case that caused you some guilt for feeling that you could have been friends with one of the inmates. Was there ever a death row case that you believe they could have been innocent of the crime they were being put to death for?
I never, in the executions I saw, no, I never felt that. But there is a difference. There were some cases where I personally wouldn't have given that person the death penalty. And that was a little bit difficult. You know, I remember specifically one, I remember it was a guy named Leonard Rojas, and I remember it was December 4th, but I don't remember what year. He had come home and found his wife and his brother basically being intimate together. And he snapped and killed them both. And usually that would be something classified under a crime of passion. And for whatever reason, in this case, it wasn't, and he was executed for it. Texas also has a law that's called the law of parties that I sometimes have a hard time with. It essentially states that if you were present when the crime is committed and you could have either stopped it or you were a participant, whether you committed the crime or not, you can be held to the same punishment. So, for example, we had that massive escape from the Connolly unit, the Texas 7, it's known as, and these 7 men escaped, and a police officer ultimately was killed trying to apprehend them. All 7 of them, well, sorry, all 6, because one killed himself before getting taken into custody, but the remaining 6 all got the death penalty, although clearly only one of them could have killed him. In that case, at least, it was applied fairly. Either all 6 men get the death penalty or all 6 men get life in prison. In this case, it was the death penalty. But there was one execution that I witnessed where it was known that the man who was being executed did not commit the crime. He was there, he was an accomplice, he was a participant, he was not the trigger man. But the person who did commit the crime, had made a deal first. And so that person did not get the death penalty. And I thought, this is a really jacked up system. If you have someone where you know that the person who actually committed this murder is serving life over here, and this guy we know didn't, is being executed for it. And it was a law of parties case, and I just had a hard time with that.
Well, like they tell you, the first person to talk gets the deal.
For sure. And that's exactly what happened there. And he was mad about it. I remember he's the only inmate that called me by my first name because, as you know, Maryanne, it's not done in the prison system. They call you by your last name. Your badge is turned around as such. Your names, all of it, it's your last name. It's not your first name. And we were roughly the same age. And he had said, Michelle, I don't understand why this is happening. And, I didn't really have an answer for him.
He spoke up first. That's why I say, don't take me to do a crime with you all, because I'll tell it. I'll be going, yeah. Take the needle off the table and I'll tell you everything.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I get this is another good question I have here. After they are executed, are the family allowed burial rights, or do they have to be buried on prison property?
Well, that is a good question. No, the family absolutely can claim the body. So they're immediately taken away from the execution chamber by a local Huntsville funeral home and taken back to the funeral home. And the family at that point can absolutely claim the body and take them home or have them taken home and handle burial arrangements as they wish. If the body is not claimed, then they're buried in the prison cemetery in Huntsville. And what we've seen, because I've attended some of those funerals, is that, being buried there doesn't mean necessarily that they either don't have family or the family doesn't care or something like that. I think, as everyone knows, funerals are incredibly expensive. And in some cases, these families have spent everything they've got on defense trying to get this person off of death row, and they just don't have it. And so there were a couple of times that I saw where the person was being buried by the prison system, but the family attended the service because they still wanted to be there.
So they're not. And if you've ever been to Huntsville, I've encouraged some of my class, some of them especially live in Texas, take a tour of Huntsville. It's a lot of them tend to think it's one prison, because somebody will say, oh, they're at the prison in Huntsville. I'm sure you got that too. And you're like, which one?
Yeah, there are a number. Yeah.
Which one?
Yes.
just to see, you can go past where where they're buried, where they bury the inmates. You can Joe Bird Cemetery. They've got a wonderful museum too that has a lot of interesting items. Has the electric chair that they used to use prior to lethal injection.
Mm-hmm.
Another question too here, Michelle, is the person, what about the correctional staff? What is their demeanor? That's one that, how are they? Was it the same staff all the time? Was there like a group of correctional staff that always worked the the death chamber?
There were, no, they would switch out, as people would take different jobs or people would be promoted or such. But for the most part, it'd be the same team in batches. For a couple of years, it would be this set of people. And then a couple of them go to different prison units. And so now it's this set of people. But usually it is a set group that is assigned to the execution duty. Whoever is the senior warden at the unit where it takes place, which is called the Huntsville, and they call it the Walls unit. Whoever's senior warden at the Walls unit presides over the executions. That tie down team that I mentioned, that consists of 5 people. Sometimes the major of the prison unit, several of the captains and stuff. The main thing for them is they had to be big guys in case there was ever any type of a fight that broke out, which I will say I only saw evidence of twice in all of those executions, that the inmate resisted and fought, trying not to go to the chamber. Bizarrely, most of them just walked and were not restrained at all. They would just walk from the holding cell to the execution chamber. But yeah, it was mostly the same people. In fact, too, when Texas was especially allowing the inmates to choose their own last meal, there was one inmate at the Walls unit, and his whole job was to prepare the last meals. He was known for that. No other inmates worked on him. It was this one particular inmate named Brian Price, and he would prepare every single last meal.
He wrote a book too, didn't he? I think he wrote a
He
book
did.
on.
He wrote a cookbook when he got
He
out.
wrote a
Yeah.
book of all what each meal. It talks pretty much about his, the one that stood out, or the one that did his first one, his last one, whatever. He wrote a really good book. I read it.
He did, yeah. He talked about, the most requested last meal is the cheeseburger, and he made
Yes.
a really amazing cheeseburger. And then after that, there were a lot of requests for like breakfast foods, but you could tell a lot of it, especially, Texas and just our cuisine and such, a lot of it was comfort food.
Yes.
Chicken fried steak, which is very popular here, fried chicken, like home style type meals that they had probably had growing up or remembered from, happier times.
Well, I remember at Darrington, whenever we had fried chicken, it was good. We always had
Yeah.
great fried. That was the day you ate. We would eat in the chow hall, in our chow hall. We'd eat chicken
Yes.
fried steak day, fried fish day. I mean,
Yes, fried fish. Yeah.
I remember those days eating that. Yes, delicious. I also have another question, and this may, I like this question because, it kind of, Jennifer's asking, is there like mandatory therapy now, with the times now on mental health and focusing on that, my classes have asked that several times. Like, I tell them the first time I witnessed a homicide or a brutal stabbing or something, I was just expected to be at work the next day. Are you
Yeah.
coming into work?
Yeah.
There was no, are you okay? What did you just see? How do you feel? There wasn't. You just
No.
lived with it and went back to work the next day. It didn't matter. And so she's asking, I would well, the person above her, Joe Johnson, says, I'm sure the persons who administer the drugs must go through a psych eval before and after. And then Jennifer says, good question. I'd like to also ask, is there a mandatory therapy? Do you think now, maybe there is, or?
No, I would sincerely doubt it. I left the prison system in 2012, so that's the last time that I witnessed an execution. And I can say, so for the 11 years that I was there was nothing like that, which later on I kind of resented. It's tricky because here's the thing. Had they offered it to me, And you know, Maryanne, what the prison system is like, you can't really admit or show any weaknesses. And it's already more difficult because you're a female working in a penal institution. So had they offered it to me, I probably would have said, no, I don't need it. I'm good.
I'm good.
But
yeah,
but it's the fact that they don't offer it. They don't ask, because nobody checks on you to see, like, are you okay? So we really only had each other. The chaplain who I, especially in the early days, was always witnessing with is a man named Jim Brazel.
yes.
They gave him the nickname the Sinister Minister, which is to me one of the funniest nicknames anyone's had at the prison system, but truly one of the kindest individuals. And a lot of people who witnessed the executions used to kind of talk to him and vent to him. I didn't, but I knew a lot of other people that did. Now the families and the witnesses, it's a totally different experience. There is a victim services division within the prison system, and they stay with the victim's family throughout the entire process to make sure that they're okay, to see if there's anything they need. They witness alongside of them, and then afterwards they kind of do a debrief. The inmates have something very similar that's out of the chaplaincy department. So the families and the actual witnesses do have access to some of that.
That's interesting. I didn't know
Mhm.
that. That's
Mhm.
interesting to know. But I think you're right about the therapy part. I think you're kind of like, I look back too and say I wouldn't have done it because again, there were times
Yeah.
I was the only woman in the cell block or in the area working,
Absolutely.
and you can't appear weak, so you'd be like, "Oh
Yeah.
no, I'm fine." And
Right.
I can tell people the actual, particulars of so much I saw because it's like it won't leave, but it doesn't bother me either. I guess I'm
Right.
desensitized to it.
Right.
Michelle, there is one story I would like you to share with them about Panchai.
I knew that was what you were going to say. Yes, one of the early executions that I witnessed was a man named Panchai Wilkerson, and he was a handful the entire time he was on death row. So he was a participant. There was an escape from death row when death row was located at a different prison unit called the Ellis unit outside of Huntsville. And there were 7 men originally that tried to escape, but only one successfully made it. Panchai was one of the ones who tried. So he did this. Then in 2000, he takes a correctional officer hostage with another inmate. So he's causing a lot of problems on death row and such. So his execution scheduled in 2000, and again, towards the beginning of when I really was witnessing them regularly. And he had all day apparently been telling the officers, I have a secret, I have a secret. And they're just blowing it off because it's him and he's always doing something. And we get there to witness the execution. I was a reporter at the time. I was in the victim's room. I was with Mike Grawczyk, the reporter from the Associated Press, and I was with Larry Fitzgerald, who was my mentor later and was the spokesman at the time for the prison system. He had escorted me and Mike in to witness this execution. They tell Panchai you can make your last statement and everything. I don't remember that he said anything. And they started the drugs. And he whispered the secret as of Wilkerson. And I saw him moving his mouth around, and then out popped a handcuff key. So with his last breath, he spit out a handcuff key, which was a giant middle finger to the Texas prison system. And immediately a huge investigation had to be launched into how did this death row inmate get a handcuff key? The thought is that he was obviously trying to escape one last time on the way to his execution, but that the one thing he didn't count on was that that's the only time when an inmate's being transported from death row to the execution chamber to that unit. It's the only time that they have 2 sets of handcuffs. And he probably obviously had the key only to one of those sets. And so realizing he couldn't actually do anything, he instead chose to hide the key until the last minute just to tell the prison system, yeah, look what I have. It was so unsettling. I found it so unsettling. I had this moment where, because again, it was still early for me witnessing these, where I thought, he's coming off that gurney and I don't know what's going to happen. I mean, I found it terrifying, and then very quickly realized he was not.
And then my coworker, my former coworker, there at Harris County Juvenile Probation, went to school with him, and
Really?
yes, remember he told that story. He goes, Panchai was such a quiet kid in school, never got in trouble or anything until he got beat up his senior year, beat up really, really bad. And that's what changed him into what I think he
Wow.
killed two or three people at a pawn shop. He robbed a pawn shop and
Yeah. Yeah.
two or
In
three
Houston.
people.
Yeah.
And it was just like, wow. And here this guy goes out with a bang. That story I always tell that story to people.
Yes, yeah, it was something. And I think that the warden who was presiding at the time, that they gave him that handcuff key in a little frame.
Oh wow.
Yeah,
Here's a memento.
yeah, basically.
Here's a memento. Um, oh, so this is an interesting question too. This is a good one. Is the prison locked down during a scheduled execution, like to monitor, I guess, everybody's inmates, where the other offenders locked down at the
No,
walls?
no. Usually the rest of the unit was open as usual, but remember the executions could begin after 6, and so
Yeah.
by then, the inmates who have work assignments and all that, they've already come back. They've had their dinner and they're back at the house. They've already gone back. So you didn't really see any inmates at all. Plus, the area where the executions took place, right when you would walk inside of the unit, you quickly made a left and went into a whole different section of the unit that was completely separated from where any of the inmates were. So I honestly can't even remember seeing an inmate when we would go in for an execution, just because we were so far off from where they were normally moving around or housed or anything like that.
That's interesting too. I kind of figured,
Mhm.
but figured you'd answer. You're the expert here, so you can answer that question.
Thank you. Thank you.
Kirsten's asking, has anyone ever confessed to more crimes, like on the gurney, like said, oh, by the way, I've killed 5 more people, or I'm a serial killer in the making, or whatever?
Not exactly that. Like, one of the really memorable ones, we had an inmate, and he had the goal, he wanted to become the most prolific serial killer of all time. So he was a pretty dangerous guy, and when the police had found him after he did commit the crimes he did, he had a journal where he had been calculating exactly how many people he would need to kill in X amount of time so that he could achieve this goal. But he was caught with the first murders, but the murders were pretty awful, and he had killed. I want to say it was a 12-year-old and an 11-year-old siblings. He killed them. Sorry, I know this is a graphic story, but just to illustrate, they found, in the case of the young girl's body, they found her body, but she had been decapitated. And so when he was on the gurney, he confessed to what he had done with her head, which was extremely distressing, as you can imagine, for the family. Um, the funny thing is that genuinely in him confessing, it wasn't to be cruel. He was apologetic, and there was nothing in it like that, but still, it's a distressing detail for this family who's come here to witness the execution to be told, and this is where the head is. It was just very distressing. But there was an inmate who had been a hitman, and he didn't do it on the gurney, but he did it a day or two before his execution. And ultimately, they gave him a stay so he could clear up these other murders, which he felt like he wanted to do because he needed to get them off his conscience. And it's funny because I met him, or saw him, I already knew him, but I saw him the day of his first scheduled execution. He was very nervous. He had his last meal, could not touch it, just could not eat because he was so nervous. They give him the stay so he can clear up these other murders. When he gets his second execution date and I saw him again, totally different person. He was able to eat. He was very calm and everything because he truly had gotten all of these off of his chest and no longer felt that same guilt that he was going to be executed with.
Kind of like a confession, good for the soul. I need to get this off
Yeah.
my chest.
Yeah.
I get that peace. Okay, I'm
Yeah.
at peace now.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
There was one other, and I think it's chilling when you realize what happened afterwards, where the inmate from the gurney said, "Look, I know I said that this other inmate helped me, but I lied. He didn't help me. I just said it, it was all me alone. And of course, when you first heard it, you thought, oh, he's just saying that stuff. It ended up being a case that's pretty famous, is of a man named Anthony Graves.
Oh, yeah.
It was determined that he, in fact, did not commit the crime. He
Right.
was not there. The prosecutors engaged in some very unethical behavior by not turning over some discovery and such during his trial. That person lost their law license and was disgraced. And he was commuted and ultimately given a complete pardon, and is now a free man, and has written books and been featured in documentaries about this experience. So it was a sort of confession where he admitted this other guy didn't do it.
One last question, because can y'all believe it's been an hour? It goes by fast. It's been interesting. Somebody asked, I can't talk. Who was the most dangerous inmate?
That I saw.
Yes,
there were
that you
two.
saw.
Yeah, there were two, and they were both serial killers. The first was, if you're familiar at all with the rail car killer, his name was
Yes.
Angel Resendez. And he was called the rail car killer because the crimes all traditionally happened near rail car tracks or railroad tracks, because that's how he got around. He was a transient and would just hop on trains and go around, and then he'd get off in some random town and kill someone nearby. What was dangerous about him was that it was his rationale. I spoke with him so many times and got to know him pretty well. And in his mind, he was killing people he felt were evil, not acknowledging what he was doing was evil, but he felt like he was doing the world a favor because these people needed to die. But one example was a couple he killed that when he broke into their home, he saw some pictures of someone in a military uniform. So he felt like they supported war, so they had to die, and he killed them. He was extremely dangerous. And I think also because if you saw him at the grocery store or something, completely non-threatening. But if you were in a room with him, I don't think you would hesitate to kill. Another serial killer was a guy named Tommy Lynn Sells, who also committed a number of crimes, and his were difficult. It was hard to catch him at first because they had no set MO, and a lot of times you'll have a serial killer who always kills in the same way or kills the same type of victim. In his case, it was all different ways, all different types of victims. And he ultimately was caught because he thought that he had killed this 12-year-old girl by slitting her throat, but she didn't die. And she was able to identify him and such. He was also extremely dangerous.
That's the part that you just, you're looking at people and, working in a prison, we were always told, don't judge, don't judge, but you can't help it sometimes. You really can't. You're looking at these people and you're thinking, wow, wow, that's all you can say. I mean, I hated to read travel cards, sometimes I would have to, and then you'd find out who it was, what they did, and you looked at them differently, you just had a whole different ideas uh
Yeah.
of who, it's it just
No, I think what was so interesting that I realized, though, was that of the people on death row, by and large, what you would classify as a psychopath was a very small number. It was a very small number of people that probably would have that clinical diagnosis. By and large, they were people who got into a bad situation and reacted extremely poorly, like most normal people don't react. Whether it was, I broke into a house because I'm on drugs and I want to get money, and the person happens to be home and they make the decision to kill them, and now they've committed capital murder. It was a lot of those types of crimes where it wasn't the intent when they went out, but it is what happened, and that's how they got the sentence.
it's just so uh it's just, in looking to it, the females that are on death row, most of them are on there for killing children, their own children at that,
Yeah.
and it's so interesting to see the difference with the males and the females,
Yeah.
and the types of crimes. So I think James is giving us this look of wind it up, girls.
Stop talking.
Stop talking. Stop talking. Stop
No, I
talking.
think like you've seen in the chat, like some of them have it exactly right. We could run this back for another 2 hours and still never re-hit on. You've got so much experience, so many cases between the two of you. It's been an amazing evening. Like I know we haven't even barely scratched the surface of what all Michelle and Maryanne have seen, but we do got to at some point wrap it up. And so let's start off by thanking our moderator, Maryanne Drenner, and thank you so much to our special guest, Michelle Lyons, for contributing their time and their insights. They did an excellent job. And thank everybody for attending this evening. It was a really insightful conversation. I was telling Michelle before we started tonight, this is one of the most requested topics I've had over the 3 years I've been doing it, but I really didn't feel comfortable having this conversation about the death penalty tonight till I had both of these two fine young professionals on board to speak on this topic. And you can see tonight why that is, because they really bring a lot of depth to the topic. So couple administrative things. You saw in there, if you're part of the Purdue Global staff and faculty, there's a link to capture your reflections for your professional development. Everybody else, you're very welcome to join us on September 11th at 6 p.m., which is also a Thursday, for our next event titled Scholarship in Public Safety, Bridging the Gap Between Theory and Practice. And the Eventbrite link is there as well. So again, thank everybody for coming in. Thank